All right, so let's continue our waltz through the phyla with the phylum Nematoda. So we've looked at several phyla already. Remember, kingdom, Animalia, phylum, Nematoda. And these are the roundworms. They're called roundworms because they're not segmented like an earthworm. And most of them are smaller than like an earthworm. But there's a lot of these things. In fact, I've heard it said that if you could make the dirt on the planet disappear, you would still see the shape of hills and valleys with the shape of nematodes because there's so many of these per square inch of soil that they're everywhere. Now this group, like I said, very common. A lot of free living species, a lot of parasitic species in this group. They have a complete digestive tract. So they have a mouth all the way to the anus. Okay, they have a alimentary canal. So the first group that we've looked at that has that feature. They do gas exchange through their skin. Kind of like the flatworms do, but these are roundworms, so they're round in shape. They're not flat, so they have less surface area to volume ratio. But they have a fluid in their body. It's not exactly blood, but it sloshes around as they move around, and it helps to distribute oxygen throughout the body. So they have kind of a crude circulatory system in that sense. And they are unsegmented, hence the name roundworms. Now this group is known as a pseudocoelomate. So we talked about acoelomates, the flatworms. They have 3 body layers, but there's no gap between any of the body layers. Now this group has an opening between the middle layer, the mesoderm, and the endoderm, the inner layer. There's a gap there, and there can be organs inside of that gap. Okay, this is known as a pseudocoelomate. That means like a fake body cavity, or not quite real body cavity, and we'll look at a true coelomate soon. And this cavity can be filled with that fluid that helps to distribute gases as they move around. So their body cavity is filled with this fluid that helps to distribute those gases and things around the body. Okay, let me get my computer to work here. There we go. There it is. I thought I had that on here. So that's a hard word to say, but pseudocoelomic fluid is the fluid that kind of acts as the circulatory system's functions. It helps to distribute materials in the body. Now, one example of a parasitic version of this phylum are heartworms. These can live inside the hearts of mammals, common in dogs and cattle occasionally, and I think every now and then humans can get this as well, but you don't hear about that very often. Heartworms are pretty disgusting disease, right? So these things can actually live in heart muscle and eat it. Trichinella, which causes the disease trichinosis. You can get this from eating undercooked pork. They live inside a muscle tissue. Here you can see these roundworms inside of this muscle tissue here. All right, now another phylum I want to mention is Phylum Annelida. Annelida means little rings. These are the segmented worms. So this phylum is the group that includes the oligochaetes. The oligochaetes is the class. So kingdom, phylum, class, oligochaetes, oligochaeta, and that's the earthworms and the leeches. This group has a true body cavity. They're called a coelomate. And so the way you can tell that they're a true body cavity is that they have an outer layer, that ectoderm. They have a mesoderm in here and an endoderm, and the mesoderm and the endoderm are connected by like little bridges here, and the body cavity is actually an opening in the mesoderm. You can see that there, and that is where the internal organs are kept inside of that, and they're suspended from the mesoderm, meaning the mesoderm's hooked to them so they don't just flop around, right? They're kind of protected inside of that mesoderm layer. Okay, and that's what a true body cavity is. That's what we have as well. So the rest of the animals we'll talk about today are coelomates. So this group contains a head with a well-developed brain, ganglia that are clustered together. The body is compartmentalized. So they have these segments, and each segment's kind of a little compartment, but they have blood vessels running the length of the body through all these segments, and they have a closed circulatory system. So they get gases from diffusion, but then they circulate them throughout the body with a circulatory system. And some aquatic ones, some of the aquatic ones might have gills as well. This group is hermaphroditic, meaning they have both sperm and egg producing structures. In earthworms, they have a clitellum, which is that band on the top of the worm that secretes a mucus cocoon that surrounds the eggs as they're laid. And as that cocoon slips over the worm's body, it releases the sperm that it stores from another worm, and it releases them into its eggs as that cocoon slips off the body into the dirt. So here's that clitellum I talked about, that little bump right there. That's an organ that secretes a mucousy cocoon for the eggs. These two worms are mating, so each one is receiving sperm from the other worm, and then they'll store that sperm, and when the eggs are being laid, they'll release that sperm, and so they have a form of external fertilization to fertilize those eggs. And these things can get really big, and of course, where are the world's biggest worms? Where else but Australia, right? Where all kinds of crazy organisms live. There's some neat organisms in Australia. Leeches are another member of this phylum, and they're used by medical doctors occasionally to help increase blood flow to certain areas. So if you go into certain forms of medicine, you might get to work with leeches. Leeches have a bite that causes your blood to stop coagulating, and then they'll latch on and they'll drink your blood, and they have a numbing agent on them, so sometimes you don't feel them. It doesn't hurt. It's weird. I found them on my foot before after going swimming, and then when you pull them off, you bleed like crazy because of that anticoagulant in their saliva. Now this phylum, this is another phylum I want to mention, a very diverse phylum. Just look at all those different kinds of critters there. This is the phylum Mollusca, the mollusks. It's a very ancient lineage, and we know a lot about their ancient heritage because they have shells which fossilize really easily. This is an example of one from the Cretaceous period, and they make jewelry out of it, actually. They call this ammonite. This organism is called an ammonite, and the mother of pearl fossil is called ammonite. This group includes a structure called a radula, which is like a tongue that's kind of like a cheese grater. Kind of, you see this image here, and they can use it to scrape algae off of rocks, or they can use it to eat other organisms. Sometimes, like there are predatory mollusks, gastropods, that actually use their radula to drill holes in the sides of bivalves and then eat the organism out from the inside. And we can actually find fossils that show the same kind of damage from millions of years ago, which is pretty amazing. So some of the groups that we have in this phylum are the bivalves, bivalva. These have a hinged shell, and most of them are suspension feeders. Here you can see this clam-like organism filter feeding, and you see all these dots here? Those are its eyes, so they can see, which is pretty cool. So that's the bivalves, the hinged shells. This group here, these are the cephalopods. Cephalopods are squid, octopus, and the nautilus. Cephalopod means head foot. These have tentacles at one end. They're usually quite intelligent. They have a closed circulatory system and are usually predatory. And quite intelligent. They can open jars and all kinds of other things. The group that crawls on their belly are called the gastropods. That means stomach foot. They crawl on their on this muscle that's called the foot. So I want to introduce you to the major parts of this group of all mollusks, but we'll use a gastropod as the example. So they have a muscular part called the foot. So in the gastropods, the foot is what they crawl on. In the cephalopods, the foot is modified into the head and the tentacles. And in this group, the bivalves, the foot is the muscle that opens and closes the shell, but it's all homologous. Okay. Then they have a mantle, which is this outer tissue here. The mantle secretes the shell in those organisms that have a shell, or it's the outer skin of like an octopus, okay? And then this area here under the mantle is called the visceral mass, and it's just all the internal organs, okay? So those are the major three parts of a mollusk. All mollusks have those three parts, and I think all of them or most of them have a mouth that contains a radula of at least a lot of those species. If we were dissecting the squid this semester, we'd look at one in person, but you should see it in that squid dissection online. You should be able to see the radula. They can grate organisms with it. It's kind of their way of chewing. It's pretty cool. All right, so that's a tour of the invertebrates so far. I want to point out that most animals are invertebrates. Something like 95% of animal species are invertebrates, hence why there's so many different phyla here that we've talked about so far. So we're going to pause here and we're going to pick up with arthropods. And pretty soon then we're going to start looking at the chordates and the vertebrates.